Our second speaker of this conference, Dr. Sumi Madhok, Associate Professor at the Gender Institute at London School of Economics. Dr. Madhok will hold a lecture entitled, "Is a non-hegemonic rights talk possible?" Sumi Madhok's research interest lies in the intersection of feminist political theory and philosophy, gender theories, transnational activism, rights, human rights, citizenship, and many more aspects. In particular, she is interested in the question of agency in the new citizenship movements, especially in South Asia. Dr. Madhok has been published widely and is one of the editors of the Sage Handbook of Feminist Theory and the author of the book Rethinking Agency, Developmentalist Gender and Rights. So a warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Can you do Oh, do I need to hold it like this? Sorry. It's a bit awkward, but thank you very much, Stefan, and thank you to Alina, to Anna, and yourself, and everyone at Sasnet for the very kind invitation. I'm delighted to be here, and also thank you very much for the papers yesterday, the great talk, and also the great family papers I heard, just really stimulating and got me to think in various kinds of ways. I'm going to speak for maybe about 40 or 41 minutes, thereabouts, okay? So, yeah, not more than that. Without further ado, as you can see up here, and I'm going to use PowerPoint because I just thought that would just be easy to keep me in check so I don't just go all over the place. You can see here that I begin actually with a question, and this question underpins, is linked with, contributes to the work of the broader project of decolonizing rights and human rights that's going around in different parts of the globe. They're a tricky kettle of fish, human rights, to say the least. And not only because questions of rights and human rights, and I'm using the two together, and you'll see why in a bit, because they're always already political and mired in contemporary global power relations. They're implicated in upholding civilizational hierarchies and keeping in place structures of coloniality. The celebratory, vexed, conflicted, oppositional responses that human rights in particular invoke are primarily because they're seen to represent both the problem and also the solution, and sometimes both simultaneously. Now, there is something quite powerfully intuitive about the idea of universal human rights and of everyone being included and covered by their protections, irrespective of any qualifications, albeit even if the history and practice of human rights has only ever been one of qualifications. They have now become the predominant language in which we express our deepest despair, our hurt and harm, whether that might be over the brutalization and inhumanity that we see and that we're witnessing being displayed around the globe as we speak, or as we sit here and as I speak, in Syria, in Kashmir. Kashmir is now entering the 70th day of military siege and 84 lives have been lost. Or whether we talk or invoke human rights to talk about the erasure and violence playing out in our interpersonal lives. So, domestic violence, sexual abuse, precarity, vulnerability and exploitation of labor, discrimination on account of sexual orientation and gender identity, racialization, racialized violence. Opening a newspaper today, again, more sort of, evidence of that coming from the United States as it happens. But as a feminist scholar, having said that, but as a feminist scholar, I'm only acutely aware of the difficulties around rights, not only between the gap between formal and actual rights, but also the gendered and paradoxical outcomes of rights discourses, of their solely mitigating nature, their innate inability to resolve harm on their own, of being identity fixing and essentializing, yet at the same, on the other hand, being blunt and ineffective if they're anything but specific. And yet, and I want to keep I want to emphasize that. And yet, the paradox of rights is that despite their paradoxical outcomes, and also the disappointments and despair arising from their attachment to privileged, gendered, and raced bodies, it is also the case that they are desired, claimed, contested, and fought for by the marginalized, the precarious, and the powerless. And that they give rise to insurgent imaginaries, engender challenges and interruption to the business of politics and neoliberal politics, as usual, and really remain the only way for the disenfranchised to mobilize. And we see this paradox playing out all around the globe, where we are witnessing, as I said before, multitudinous struggles over rights. Several of these are collective struggles by marginal and dispossessed groups over what are known as, or what Walter Mignolo has called, life rights, with some resisting precarity and dispossession under neoliberal developmentalism and against the privatization of natural resources, mountains, minerals, forests, rivers, streams, while others are struggling to redefine the substantive content of existing formal constitutional guarantees. But the question that I've been struggling for, and the question that I'm going to be placing here before you today, really is, how do we conceptually capture these struggles? That's the question that for me has been something that I've been struggling with. Now in South Asia, and particularly in India, many of these rights struggles have not been without policy and legislative successes, and several pioneering innovative legislative acts are now in place guaranteeing citizenship, entitlements to information, food and employment. All of you know this, and I don't need to go into this at all. And now there exists a growing and sophisticated and very important scholarship analyzing the functioning, the shortfalls, as well as the impact of these newly introduced policy and policy measures. Within this burgeoning scholarship, and very important scholarship, I have to insist, and more generally, however, there is somewhat less attention paid to the conceptual and epistemic languages of rights underpinning these struggles by marginal groups, or to the nature of subjectivities and subjections these mobilizations engender, or indeed to the forms of rights politics these generate. To put it more specifically, we are yet to know of the justificatory premises of rights that informs and activates demands for expanded entitlements, or of the nature of rights languages underpinning self-making exercises mobilized in becoming a subject of formal rights, or of the traversal of rights and human rights, or indeed of the ways by which statecraft, governmentalities, and the market intersect and facilitate the dissemination of particular rights subjectivities. In short, we know altogether very little of how rights languages are constituted and articulated by marginal subjects. Now, these questions really came to the fore when I started tracking ethnographically grassroots mobilizations particularly under the right to food movement in India. And these grassroots mobilizations are myriad. They are dealing with different kinds of rights, whether it be forest rights, Dalit rights, women's rights, and so on and so forth. But also looking at the land rights mobilization in Pakistan, the Anjuman Mazari, which actually the peasants, or which is the Punjabi peasants, the peasants' mobilization in the Punjab, which is possibly the only public phase of resistance, open resistance to the military state in Pakistan. So after a few years of trying to think about some of these questions and think around them, quite unsuccessfully, I have to say, in a conceptual way, it soon became apparent to me that these questions called really for a study oriented towards looking at the emergence and operation of rights cultures in marginal contexts, or what Partha Chatterjee has called most of the world. And also that their study required a different conceptual lens, one that was able to capture their dynamism, their difference, but also in some ways what Depeche was flagged yesterday, resources, right? So the intellectual resources that we can gain from them. And I've called this different conceptual lens vernacular rights cultures. So studying vernacular rights cultures, I have to say, is part of the larger project of decolonizing human rights. However, it also places a supplementary imperative, a supplementary demand on this larger project of decolonizing human rights. And the supplementary, well, if you think about the project of decolonizing human rights, which is going on, which is extremely vibrant and exciting, is very much, not only, but very much and predominantly engaged in producing counter-histories of human rights, right? It's engaged in producing sort of alternative genealogies, alternative historical trajectories of human rights. And so However, my intervention here is that this work of decolonizing human rights, mostly engaged in providing alternative genealogies, must be supplemented by conceptual work aimed at capturing the stakes and struggles over rights and human rights around the globe, without losing sight of the fields of power in which these operate and the power relations they propagate. Now, this is really important because this is not some kind of argument coming from uncritical indigeneity or sort of a neo-nativist argument. You know, these things one has to be quite careful that one doesn't fall into those kinds of traps. And so to intervene, therefore, conceptually, is to intervene in current rights thinking. And current rights and human rights thinking really occurs across a number of registers, but mostly around analytical thinking on what is the nature and structure of rights, for example, or indeed the larger philosophical terrain of rights at this point, which is the right to have rights. Right? So this is the larger philosophical terrain. And I have to kind of admit a particular disciplinary bias here, because I am really looking at particular at textual work, theoretical and philosophical work within political theory and philosophy. Now, to say one thing in relation to that, to insist then on conceptual work on rights and human rights is really in that moment to insist on the productivity of rights, right? To insist on how rights mobilizations produce particular political imaginaries, subjectivities, political cultures, gendered relations, and these speak back, or have to speak back, to received and conventional theories of rights and human rights. So in a way, we're moving away simply beyond suffering rights as paradoxes to really looking at, and beyond thinking simply in terms of limits and critiques of rights, which a lot of progressive work on rights thinking does, to thinking in terms of hopeful possibilities. Because after all, these rights mobilizations are mobilized around the hopeful possibilities that rights discourse brings. Right? Now, to speak of productivity of human rights, therefore, is not to not call out the Eurocentrism of the rights discourse. In effect, it's really it's to constantly challenge it and relentlessly challenge it everywhere and in whatever mode. But it is also, if you like, to relentlessly challenge it with conceptual work on, as I said, stakes and struggles around rights thinking. And at the same time, this is something I borrow straight from Depeche, is really to relentlessly challenge it with conceptual work, which acknowledges its implication in Eurocentric discourses, while simultaneously aims to disrupt, dislodge, and displace these. Now, the importance of saying this here is because it's in some ways it separates me out, or I see a little bit of gap between myself and my work, and particularly, say, for example, lots of the decolonial strategies. Right, to de-link, if you like, which are the de-linking strategies of de-linking from Eurocentric discourses, and I remain unconvinced that we can actually ever de-link from Eurocentric discourses, or produce a version of pure, uncontaminated, non-Eurocentric scholarship, or even produce a third world perspective. In fact, I refuse all these claims of purity and authenticity, and this will become a little bit clearer as I move along in the paper. But having said that, of course, we must call out the specific problem of Eurocentrism. And in relation to the rights and human rights talk, the specific problem of Eurocentrism that I'm going to call out, because we have to be very specific and we have to be very precise and we have to make that kind of intervention. The specific problem that I'm going to call out today is the problem of the politics of origins. Now, the politics of origins and its significant effect, which is time-space provincialism, by time-space provincialism, I simply mean that the epistemic center of human rights, intellectual thinking, is temporally and geographically located in the West. So even if the timeline, even if there are efforts to produce non-teleological histories of human rights that you're seeing in the last 10 years, for example, say Samuel Moyn, or indeed Lynn Hunt, the location, so even if that timeline changes, right, the location of those histories remains steadfastly in place. The location remains resolutely fixed. In other words, the geopolitical context of epistemic inquiry remains stationary. Now, this politics of origins and the time-space provincialism is shared really by both the celebrators and detractors of human rights. And I don't know if I'm sure many of you followed the announcement around the surrogacy bill for example, which was announced quite interestingly by Sushma Swaraj, which also gives you an indication of the audience in mind. Right? It is the foreign minister making that announcement rather than somebody from the health ministry or somewhere else. And so she, of course, says here, and I'm not going to take a chance and try and click on this, but this is from the Indian Express, this particular quote. She says, and the bill is marred with exclusions of various sorts, right? But here, in particular, she says, we do not recognize homosexual or live-in relationships. That is why they are not allowed to commission babies through surrogacy. It is against our ethos. Of course, the proverbial question here is who is the we and who is the our here? Madam Minister. But having said that, let's move swiftly on. But this is quite interesting because it is again mired in that same kind of originary impulse, which by the way, doesn't only, like I said, is shared by both celebrators and detractors, but also by progressive critiques of human rights, and also by those who seek to vernacularize human rights. And here I have in mind a lot of anthropological work. It also underpins the various binary distinctions that you see sketched out, right, between Asian values, Asian values, Western values, universalism versus cultural particularism, authoritarian economic development versus human rights. So there's a great deal of investment in this business of binaries. But of course, binaries do particular kinds of work, right? And these binary distinctions do the work of keeping epistemic hierarchies intact, in that they actively reproduce the binaries of the epistemic, authorial, global versus the non-epistemic, only ever translating local, and thereby foreclose agentable activity and authorship of rights from elsewhere, now not least from the margins. Now, this politics of origins, as I said, has a very serious epistemic impact, right? So they do particular kinds of work. And the kinds of things that they do is that they allow the telling of only particular kinds of human rights and rights stories, right? So only particular kinds. So the three particular stories of human rights that are told, right? And this is how we teach, right? So just look at our curriculum. This is all over the place. Teleological histories. So even though we might not go all the way from antiquity to modernity, look at the kinds of ways in which human rights are taught and the way in which we engage in human rights talk. The waves of human rights, right? So starting, so not from antiquity, but say from the founding moment of republicanism, right? So you have the declarations of the rights of man and citizen, the American Declaration of Rights, and you go on straight from there, bypassing all those 150 years, straight to the UDHR, and then you go around, swanning around the Cold War, and then go to the, fall of the Berlin Wall, and there we are, right? So there's a particular kind of history that is told. Then you also have the story of global governance, right? So this is the post-World War II story. So you've got the growth of international institutions, particularly of international law, the work that international lawyers have done, and so on and so forth. And then finally you have the third story, which is the story of the unfolding of global justice, and the large international organizations, Amnesty International, and so on and so forth. And this is the kind of story that Samuel Moyn picks up in his work, The Last Utopia. And then the international humanitarianism, so all accompanying all of that. But what if the kinds of rights struggles that I've been trying to tell you about, what if the stories that they're telling, none of them map onto these three stories? What do we do then? What if, for example, this? Earlier we used to take the produce openly from the jungles and without any restriction, and then suddenly we were told that there was a prohibition on the forest produce, as this was now a sanctuary for wild animals. This is from my rights ethnographies amongst Adivasi women, Adivasi groups actually, not only women, but Adivasi groups in Udaipur, in Kotra district. We were told that we could not build homes or rear our animals and sow the field inside the jungle. We were told that this was now protected land and a sanctuary. This is about they're resisting the sanctuary, but the sanctuary is already there, but now they're resisting the declaration of a national park in that region. And that they were now going to develop a park inside, the national park, and that tourists were going to come from abroad to visit the sanctuary. We continue to take the produce from the forests. We only take what we need. We are the owners of this jungle and the lands. We have haq over these. Wherever there are Adivasis, there are jungles. In the cities, there are no jungles. We have protected the jungles. The haq over these forests and water come from our ancestors. These are our sacred lands. Our ancestral spirits reside here. We have ancestral rights over these lands. Our forefathers have used this land for centuries. We tell the state forest officials, you do your job and stay here, and that together we can stop the jungle mafia who go into the jungles in their lorries illegally and for commercial purposes, but you cannot stop us from taking the produce for our own use from these jungles or force us off our own land. Or consider this particular justificatory premise, which is much more straightforward in terms of citizenship. And this is from the workers of the NKSS, so very much at the forefront of particular kinds of citizenship-based guarantees. As citizens, we have haq over these roads. The road is built with our money. It is our money because we pay income tax. We pay also tax on whatever we buy. This is how the Sarkar builds hospitals and schools. It builds these with our money, the money that people think is Sarkari, or the building that is deemed to be Sarkari, we say to them, it is not Sarkari, it is our building, and it is our money. Our democracy must be safeguarded, for that will make our rights safe. Our efforts should be that the Constitution continues to guarantee the rights of citizens. Or another variant of the same kind of citizenship argument. As a council member, I have a haq in the panchayat to get development done in the village. Do only men have the right to speak and conduct political business? Are not women to enjoy these rights equally? It is a fight for my haq and a fight I have to fight myself. The government has given these rights to women. Indira Gandhi started the Mahila Raj of women. Before her, there were no women's rights. It's quite an interesting statement to make. In case the government changes our rights, then we have to fight the government. After all, it is us who make the government. And I'll come back to some of what these mean for rights thinking towards the end. But just going on with that question of rights and politics of origin and the kinds of epistemic impact that they have. Of course, you might just say, okay, you know what? Sure, these stories don't fit, but maybe they're just anomalies and they're aberrations. Why don't we can note them as anomalies and aberrations, and let's just get on with it. But actually, the problem is that it's not simply a case of them being only anomalies and aberrations, but the problem is that they exist as anomalies and aberrations because of the existing structure, internal logic governing these conventional stories of human rights, and of course that they're also mired in time-space provincialism. Now, this matters, as I said, there is very serious epistemic effect of politics of origins because one, the scant attention that's paid to conceptual descriptions of right struggles in most of the world. You will not find any, okay, I'm putting a wager on this, so if you find some, well, come back to me. But thus far, none of the really sort of influential texts within political, philosophical texts on rights and human rights which take these struggles on board and try and think through the implications of this. So, for example, you might ask as to why is it the case that despite the fact that we're witnessing all these struggles around the globe, and mostly in the global south, these have yet to preoccupy, as I said earlier, philosophical and theoretical scholarship on human rights, which constitutes or which continues to be predominantly focused on the Anglo-American European experience of the right to have right, and on a particular temporality, which is the founding originary moment of republicanism. So, the Declaration of Rights of Man and the kind of democratic paradoxes, the gap between the rights of men and rights of citizens produce, and so on and so forth. And the right to have rights, which again, reformulated by Hannah Arendt, and that has now come up to become really the dominant sphere of philosophical thinking and the terrain. Now this kind, not only that it means that there's scant and meager attention paid to conceptual descriptions of what is going on, but also this kind of scant and conceptual descriptions leads to very partial descriptions of the world. But of course you'll say descriptions are always partial, representations are always partial, but these are particularly partial descriptions. For example, I want you to think about the manner in which what I call the depoliticization thesis has taken hold, right? By the depoliticization thesis, and you've heard it. I mean, you cannot walk the corridors of the academy and not be completely, thrown off by the lament, the constant lament. How we're all depoliticized. Under neoliberalism, we've become these depoliticized subjects. We have no stake in any kind of politics. We are just constantly consuming subjects. That's what neoliberalism has done to us. That's our primary identity, yeah? And every time I hear this depoliticization thesis, right, my standard response is, where are you looking, right? I mean, that is my standard response. Because the point about the question of where are you looking is actually quite a serious question, because this depoliticization thesis has now taken such a strong hold that now we're told, in lots of influential texts published in the last 1 year or so, that what we are now witnessing is the impending death of the homo politicus, right? This is what we're witnessing. The political citizen is now, for all purposes, dead. And so this is really troubling, because it means that there's this absolute refusal to look at what's going on in different parts of the world. And so thinking through vernacular rights cultures then not only challenges this sort of the lack of conceptual work, but also disrupts and displaces it, while at the same time insisting that it be productive and that it also be conceptual. Now, how to study vernacular rights cultures? It is, as you can see, involves so many questions. It's an epistemic question, plus an empirical question. It's also a conceptual question. It's also a methodological question. Viewing rights politics, then, through the framework of vernacular rights cultures, and I've said that in different kinds of ways throughout, but let me just put it together right now, offers a lens through which we study the complexity and dynamism of rights-based mobilizations, which might be analytically captured not simply as those which are mimetic, engaged in translation and enacting of global human rights, but as those which have specific languages of rights and entitlements, grounded in specific political imaginaries, justificatory premises, subjectivities. In short, vernacular rights cultures generate both a distinct set of rights and distinct practices through which rights are delivered, but also transform rights that are inscribed in constitutions and political imaginaries. Now, a critical way of looking at aspect of vernacular rights cultures is the focus on the conceptual and literal languages of rights. Okay, and it also means that one way of looking at the literal and conceptual languages of rights, well, in addition to that, also looking at the political imaginaries of rights. And an important way of documenting and analyzing rights languages and the political imaginaries is to examine the justificatory premises that underpin political struggles around claim making. So I kind of wonder if, and before I come to the historical ontology bit, the three narratives that I presented earlier on, the word that kept coming on was the word hak. And that was the word that was used by predominantly by all my, all the people I've been working with since 1999, actually. This is when I started my PhD. All of them continue to use the word hak. Of course, there are other words that exist, right? So you can say, well, what about adhikar and so on and so forth? Yes, but the word hak has a particular normative ontological quality to it, which lends itself to particular kinds of ways of being in the world and of ways of making up self. Which I'll come to it in a bit. And of course the question then the word hak, I don't need to say to this audience, is the Urdu Hindustani Arabic word for a right. It appears in the Hindustani Urdu lexicon through the influence of Persian subcontinent, cuts across geographical, religious, linguistic boundaries to become the principal word deployed to make a right claim, both in northern India, where I've been looking at these rights mobilizations, and also in Pakistan. Now, of course, the word hak is not limited to South Asia. Of course, it is the predominant word used to signify a right throughout many parts of South Asia, Middle East, and also North Africa. And we know this, and although hak threads through several geographical regions, the precise deployment of the term is informed by the particular political imaginaries in which it's embedded and which in turn are animated by its deployment. There's some very interesting work on the ways in which hak operates or is deployed in different parts, for example in North Africa and in parts of the Middle East. And I'm thinking about particularly by the work of the anthropologist Lawrence Rosen, by Clifford Geertz, by Susan Hirsch, who've all looked at the ways in which hak operates as an orienting concept within Islamic juristical thinking. right? So they are really looking at particular context of Islamic jurisprudentialism to look at the kind of normative, metaphysical, ideas of haqq, which are also moral in many ways, and govern the ways in which people are in the world, in particular parts of the world. But of course you might, but as in my own ethnographies, of course, the use of the word haqq is not limited to Islamic context at all, or to Islamic jurisprudentialism, even if some of these meanings of haqq overlap, but has a wider presence that includes claim making, seeking expanded entitlements from the state and its secular legal framework, not always in alignment with Islamic juristical settlements of haqq. And of course, you might, of course, at this point ask me, so how does haqq do the category work of rights, right? And how do we go about, if you like, capturing this category work of rights that haqq does conceptually? Now, a conceptual investigation into haqq and its doing of this category work of rights, after several years of trying to think through this, I think what it requires is trying to do something like a historical ontology, right, of haqq. And I come to what I mean by, or what people have meant by historical ontology and what I take from them. Now, in order to think about conceptual descriptions of haqq and the way to think about it conceptually, I'm very, very drawn to Ian Hacking, the philosopher Ian Hacking's work on historical ontology. Ian Hacking is a wonderful philosopher, and I like his work a great deal. But what I like about his work is what a wonderful interlocutor of Foucault he is. He's a wonderful interlocutor of Foucault, and of course he takes the term historical ontology from Foucault's piece on what is enlightenment. And that is the only time, actually, that Foucault uses the word historical ontology, so it's quite different from the rest of his conceptual apparatus that we are so used to. And Hacking then, and it is Hacking's interpretation of historical ontology that I find really useful. For Hacking, historical ontology of concepts, right? He's interested in looking at how concepts come into being. For Hacking, a concept is a word in its sights. That's what it is. And so in order to get at a conceptual investigation, you need to look at what are those elements of those sites, what kinds of materialities, what kinds of institutional, institutions, what kinds of subjectivities, what is the organizing work that a concept does in a particular site. That's how Hacking interprets historical ontology. And so for him, if one takes Hacking seriously, and which I try and do, is to really look at how concepts come into being, in this case haqq, how does it come into being in a particular way in the political struggles that we're talking about, how does it acquire meanings, how does it make up people, produce new possibilities for relating to themselves, aid production of subjectivities, how do people constitute themselves in and through haqq. So, thinking through Hacking's version then, means examining the political imaginaries that haqq operates in, accords intelligibility to, the ethical commitments it produces, and the forms of subjectivities it engenders, the kind of people it makes up. In short, it would mean to examine the realm of possibilities that haqq puts into motion. Remember I talked about helpful possibilities of rights and human rights. So what is the realm of possibilities that haqq puts into motion? I've identified all of these things, and I'm particularly drawn to Ian Hacking because of his insistence on words and studying words and concepts. But also through him, it directs me to my own work and my own long-standing interest on speech practices and the question of political subjectivation, how that occurs through and via concepts, but also how that is through, and how we come to access that through particular speech practices. Particularly in context of severe subordination, where you've got to move away from this kind of free action bias kind of thing that goes through. And Stefan talked about my work on agency, and so moving away from that free action bias to thinking in terms of speech practices and how people represent themselves within that, through speech practices. The other thing I want to kind of insist here is that the imaginaries of haqq that are co-produced in these political struggles are invoked and produced within multiple and diverse encounters with developmentalism, statism, legal constitutionalism, and activism. So you can see that there is no pure, authentic idea of haq as it is that exists. It comes through particular kinds of ways through all of these. Right? So this is not a kind of freestanding abstraction that I'm talking about here at all. And so the context of struggle is very important, because by focusing on struggle, and of course I'm looking at political struggles, right? So the context of struggle is important because it shows through not only the ways in which haq pushes at the boundaries of the realm of possibilities, whether they might be gendered possibilities and so on and so forth, but it also, it also draws attention to the limitations of haq as well, right? What will it allow and what will it disallow? What are the kinds of normative possibilities? Remember, it's a normative ontological term. What will it allow? And one of the things that is very striking in all of these rights mobilizations is that the gender question always has to be begged separately. It simply doesn't come up organically in any of these rights movements. It always has to be begged separately. And that, of course, in itself draws attention to not only the interdependence of rights, but also the intersectional nature. And the moment you bring differently gendered bodies in it, you have all kinds of scope for conflict. And so rights are inherently interdependent. Feminist theorists have been talking about the interdependence of rights and moving away from those Machiavellian categories of, separating rights out as civil and political and economic and so forth. So, but it's really out there to see the interdependence, the intersectionality of rights, and it is that intersectionality of rights, the talking of civil and political rights alongside democratic and individual rights, which makes rights politics, especially by gendered subjects, makes rights politics so conflictual. Okay, so just to say very quickly that the kinds of political imaginaries and in these movements and the justificatory premises of haq that I've been identifying over these years are really precisely about 4 or 5, depending on how you count them, right, or how you read them. So the first two are the two ones on citizenship and legal constitutionalism as a justificatory premise for haq. Yes, rights and entitlements of the prior, so they're coming from a particular. The entitlements are the justificatory premise of using haq and demanding rights, by the way, from the state, because that is around the mobilization of the Forest Rights Act. But that justification is not, the demanding of rights is not based on the justification that rights are state-derived. They have an independent justification. Haq as an Islamic ideal of right conduct, and also haq as a moral idea of truth. And so all of these, you might ask, okay, so how do all of these relate to the work of speaking back to theory, right? What are they doing? What they're doing, and I'll come back to it depending on about maybe 5 minutes, 6 minutes, do I? Yeah? Okay, so I'll come back to show you in some detail what I mean by that, but just to go over very quickly, what all of these do in terms of the analytical and conceptual work on rights and human rights is this. They show us that rights need not necessarily be derivative. So that umbilical connection between state and citizenship that you find in a lot, and actually predominantly Western political theory and philosophy is pretty much, you don't see it so much here. Yes, they might have it, but in the end there's always a twist. I'll come to that twist. There's a distinction between rights and entitlements. So rights and entitlements are almost always used interchangeably, but there is a distinction between rights, and these get played out very much. Here, they're non-dichotomous. Because if you think about it, the conceptual work, the theoretical work, the philosophical work on rights is very much pushed or propelled by dichotomies, right? Whether it might be the dichotomy between individual rights or individual autonomy and the public good, or the dichotomy between freedom as an abstract idea and freedom in a particular context and so on. But what these justificatory premises and the political imaginaries they show off is that there's a cosmic inseparability and indivisibility from the public good. I'm not saying it comes through all of them, but it certainly comes through the entitlements of the prior, right? This idea of cosmic inseparability. And also, it's also linked with questions of duty and it does interesting things to questions to the relationship between rights and obligations. But also exceeds humanism. And this was something that I was thinking about when you raised the phenomenological axis yesterday. And it's really quite interesting because it led me to think about how the limits of extending rights and human rights. So even in philosophers such as, who don't espouse, say, rights-based morality, right? Say somebody like Joseph Raz, for example, will also still then, stop at not extending rights to somebody who is not another individual or not another sentient being. So, but this actually exceeds humanism in many ways. So speaking back to theory, I've said that in many ways already, but the first two are the justificatory premises of citizenship in particular, and also the entitlements of the prior. As I said, they're non-derivative from the state. They always talk about a haq. If you remember, they said, if the government changes our rights, we must change the government because it is us who make the government. So the justification is not linked directly to the government or to the state, but there is, so in that moment, haq has possibly an independent moral authority of its own. So it could be said to lie in a zone of non-coincidence, if you like, between rights and the positive legal order of the state. Okay, so it has a moral authority of its own. But also, this is what I was just talking about earlier in terms of that, of thinking about humanism. So the not only dichotomous relationships that's the kind of driving force behind a lot of rights thinking in terms of establishing who the jural correlatives are, right? So who is it that I have a duty to in that moment, and who I have a right, but that right will only exist if there's somebody else who has a duty and obligation towards me, right? So the question of when is a right a right, and when is it a valid right, when is a manifesto right? So all kinds of very fine-grained stuff going on. But unlike the moral individualism that sort of underpins a lot of that thinking, haq is not the moral property of self-regarding individuals. It does not engage only in establishing jural correlatives between pairs of individuals, but actually signifies relational connections. It does not set up, as I said, dichotomous relations between individual and public good, signifies a cosmic inseparability, but neither humanism nor moral sovereignty of the individual or their interests, whether collective or individual, underpin the justification of haq, particularly in haq as entitlements of the prior. So haq then in that moment, if you think about the entitlements of the prior, upholds a cosmological and a normative order that includes duties. And those duties extend to beyond sentient beings. They extend to nature, right? So they sort of say, oh, well, whenever there's a fire in the forest, it's not that the forest officials are going to come and, put out the fire. It's us. It's us, and we do it not because we are asked, but because we have a duty to protect nature. So haq then in that moment exceeds humanism and is not only confined or only consistent with humanism. This is something I borrowed from Joseph Raz. This is his statement. Something has to be, these rights can only be extended if they are consistent with humanism, whether you believe in a rights-based morality or not as a philosophical premise. So haq then invokes a social and political imaginary of living in the world alongside other species being. So I thought I'd end that because that connects with that we've got phenomenological access. Okay, I think I'm going to end here.
Thank you so much for an interesting lecture. We have some time for Q&A. There's a lot of people interested in that. Good.
Do you want to collect the questions first, or do you need to just answer?
What do you want?
Depending on how many there are, and get the questions in.
I think we'll take one at a time.
Okay.
I mean, there is.
Thank you very much for this great lecture. So you have to forgive me because I came just a few minutes late, so you may have said something to the effect which I'm going to ask. The whole question of decolonization which you pose is something extremely close to what a lot of us are working on in many different various ways. What I wanted to ask you was, how would you trace the whole turn to Eurocentrism within the human rights discourse? When did human rights become Eurocentric? And I'm asking you this because there have been some recent studies which precisely show that the origin of human rights is actually, or the legislations or the whole international regimes, is closely related to the decolonization movement in the third world. And if you look at the archives in the United Nations of a wide variety, what it shows is that it is the newly independent nations who are extremely keen on safeguarding the rights and which comes out of their own experience of having been colonized. So, when we speak about decolonization today, we probably also need to figure out, when did the need to decolonize human rights arise to begin with? So where did this term come from, this Eurocentrism? Because we are speaking about decolonization in multiple ways, in many different areas, but human rights is not just like other areas. It has a way more complex and complicated history, and it is precisely that history of colonization, decolonization, and liberation. So I would just like you to reflect, how does it, because your project is all about, you want to go back, you want to vernacularize, and speaking about HUC probably, if I understand.
But not to use vernacularized, because I have a problem with vernacular.
Me too, and which is why I got a little bit concerned about that. So,
Okay, so thank you. Thank you very much for your question. Yes, and actually, it's really great you asked me that, because I think I forgot to say, when talking about the teleological histories and the collusions that they generate, and then is that, of course, there are no histories of decolonization which are taken on board when those histories are written. And there are no, in fact, it's really quite interesting that decolonization, or the movements for decolonizations, are not regarded as human rights movements by particular histories. And you will see that in the work of Simon Moyn, for example. And they will particularly say that actually, yes, decolonization was going on, but you know what, that's not part of what we see as humans. So you have that in mind. I kind of thought that, right. So there is, and not only just decolonization, right? But not only just the histories, but also the struggles against imperial domination, struggles against slavery, struggles against, for civil rights. In fact, it's really interesting that how even civil rights do not come in the rubric of human rights, given the fact that Malcolm X actually pointed out very, very, that I don't want to be seen as talking about civil rights, I want to be seen as talking about human rights, right? And he has a particular point as to why he made that statement, because it's a very famous statement that he talks about, I don't want a civil rights because I want a human rights, because it has a particular kind of legitimacy that civil rights doesn't have. So yes, but simply to say that all those histories are simply or against racial oppression and so on and so forth, those histories are not taken into account. And so when I was talking about teleological histories, those don't even come. And even when people are forced to kind of acknowledge, they will sort of say, oh well, you know what, that's not proper human rights business, right? So yes. So the question of, and that is why I think that the production of alternative genealogies is extremely important. And so you need to do that. And that comes in various kinds of forms, right? So you would have not only inclusion in the curriculum, so you will start talking about different people, not simply of, the various kinds of, the ways in which human rights starts. So you have a big, larger repertoire, William Du Bois, you would talk about Gandhi, you would talk about, various other people. Whole range. And you would also include various other experiences. So the Haitian experience would become, the revolution would become important, which is never taught, right? Even if you think about, and so it simply doesn't exist. So in that kind of historical writing. And so that's what I was pointing out to you. So the alternative, but my point is not to stop only at producing alternative genealogies. You need to do something else, right? You need to produce conceptual descriptions as to what those alternative genealogies, or what the work that alternative genealogies in terms of conceptual work they bring to the table. And that's what I was trying to do.
Yeah, thanks for a fascinating talk. I have a question on HUC, and I'm not sure, I don't know if you can answer it, but I was thinking about HUC, that you said it breaks away from the state, it cuts away that umbilical relationship of the individual to the state. It's also collective, and it's based on a sort of moral system. So I was thinking, in that case, who theoretically would who guarantee HUC? And in what shape would that morality take in concrete everyday life if we no longer had that sort of thing?
Yeah.
And you ended up mainly in duties, but then although you started with rights, and ended up with the duties that people have.
Yeah. That's great, thank you. Again, it brings me to points that in the interest of trying to rush through this, I didn't talk about that. The really interesting thing about the question of them, some of them being non-derivative, is is really to point out the fact that even though the justification premise would be non-derivative, rights require implementation by the state. Right? So that's the kind of really interesting scenario that you find yourself. So it's not simply saying, oh, we don't need the state. Of course, they're all mobilizing for the Forest Rights Act at that point, right? I mean, it is precisely because, but at the end of the day, the premise in terms of where, on what basis, if you like, what is the philosophical basis on which you're struggling for rights is not so that, yes, we want expanded citizenship entitlements and we need that through the state, but not because the state is the source, if you like, right? Not because that we derive everything from the state, right? And so therefore there's always this constant, if you like, this, about fine line between, yes, we need it from the state, but you know what? If the state doesn't give it to us, we have to do something about it, right? So it's a slightly different kind of way of, so it's non-derivative, but at the same time, they're requiring implementation by the state. And the other thing is really what your question alludes to, and I wanted to have said this actually, is that yes, it's non-derivative, and of course they use all the various kinds of justification premises, but which are non-derivative and not to state. However, as I was saying, there are limitations of Huck, right? So the question of gender equality is always talked about in constitutional legal terms, right? So you would talk about Huck in various kinds of ways, and and of course one could ask as to when was the first, in terms of think about hacking and historical ontologies and how the concepts come into being and how do they become particular kinds of organizing concepts. The word Huck, and most of my ethnographies, the women simply told me that the Huck, that till they became part of this movement, or till they became part of the development program that I was looking at earlier, that they never imagined that Huck would be something that was applicable to women, or much less done to women, for instance. It was a very masculine term. It oriented particular kinds of relations, gendered relations. So when you're talking, so even in that entitlements of the prior, so Huck will be used to talk about various kinds of, collective rights, for example, but also in relation to property rights, right? But when it came to talking about Huck for women, even in that entitlement, it would be the legal constitutionalist discourse that would come to the fore. Right? So you see this constant, it's an overlapping discourse.
No, Sumi, it's a wonderful talk, and you did it much better. I wrote Provincializing Europe somewhat in a similar spirit, but I think your execution is much better than that.
Please, can I have somebody record it?
For the question, so I have at least in this presentation, I think you haven't completely eliminated the possibility of tolerance. We can talk about that later.
Yeah.
But the question I had, which is about Huck and rights, now, and which connects back to the question of the other species and being with other species, goes back to a notion which is, I think, novel in the world, in the sense that it comes from European political thought. If you find it in Hobbes, you find it in Locke, it gets into even Heidegger's notion of dwelling, which eventually gets written to the human rights concept, which is that the task of politics and the task of the state is to secure the life of every human being from predation, and predation not only by wild animals but by also other humans, right? And if you read Heidegger on Rilke, Heidegger begins from this premise that dwelling is about safety and security. But at the same time, think about the Mughals in the 17th century. The discourse of Huck is there, but there is no assumption that the job of anybody is to secure human rights. So even if you're a member of the Mughal nobility, one of the things you had to do, you had to learn the skills for killing and getting killed. You never got promotion in Akbar's court or anything without being able to wield the sword. So therefore, there's a particular European thought which eventually gets written into the human rights proposition at a time when there are 3 billion people on the planet. The cost of securing 7.5 billion people lives, the cost to the biosphere is much higher than the cost of securing let's say 3 billion lives on the planet. And I think, so it's not as such the concept of rights that's the problem. The problem we face is that we are committed to this value, which I think is in origin European, that every human life must be secured. You know, in most societies, people learn to die. And that's how people were trained, whether you're rich or poor. This new concept, actually, to me it's becoming increasingly clear, had a demographic assumption. See, whereas the idea of hawk never had a demographic assumption. So yes, we have this relationship with the jungle, but the tiger may kill me. Right? There is this idea that my life has to be secured from a predatory animal. And therefore I have this relationship of actually sometimes killing tigers, sometimes getting killed by them. And therefore this very collective relationship to dying gets written into European thought. We all accept it through the acceptance of modern medicine. One of the things that's least criticized in even decolonizing stories is the gift of modern medicine. So the Filipino historian Ray Leto has a wonderful essay on anti-colonial discourse in the Philippines.
Sorry, could you just...
Ray Leto, I think in a book edited by David Arnold, where he says that something that was never criticized in Filipino anti-colonial discourse is the coming of modern medicine. Because it saved lives, right? And this, I think, it becomes an emergent value, becomes a universal value, and it's not a problem, it becomes a problem with numbers growing. So it seems to me that the category that needs to be introduced into the thinking that you're doing now is the question of demography. And that's a very difficult thing to think, which is really the population question.
So we'll have 2 more questions, starting with you after. You want to answer first?
I don't think there's an answer to this.
And maybe I'm continuing in the same line, because I was very fascinated by the last line of your presentation that was about what Deepak also added. It is like Deepesh also said, sorry for this mistake. And actually my name is Rashmi, I'm so used to being called by all sorts of names. So I think I recognize that. Yeah. But what I want to point out is, it was the last line where you said it's living in this world along with other species and beings. And I'm born in a Jain family, in the Gamba Jain family in North India, where the idea is about ahimsa paramo dharma. Ahimsa paramo dharma, not even an insect should be killed. So it is about this fire or the original understanding of living in harmony with other beings. And could you sort of give us more explanations? You used this example of forest protection, and also how about the animal protection law? How do they sort of coexist? We talk of human rights, this animal protection rights. So what is the tension, and how do we sort of go further with it, this existence of different species? And is it Western, or is it newer, or it is thousands of years old with this origins in ahimsa paramo dharma, non-violence? If you don't, I mean, that's like ultimate is non-violence.
I just take just a very quick, but thank you for that. I think that, what Deepesh was pointing out earlier, the demographic question is really also in some ways like that, what you were trying to indicate in terms of the responses to
So the demographic question, I think, yes, and I think that particularly in relation to that, the pull and the push, right? The tussle between animal rights and so on. And so, yes, there is a particular discourse, but the animal rights discourse is quite separate. It's a quite different kind of a discourse. And of course, the whole question of the sanctuary and the national park is about the protection, is part of the animal rights discourse, right? And so what they are actually saying at that point is that, that animal rights discourse, don't come to us with that. Because in some ways, we embody that, but we don't do it in that kind of separate ways, right? In a very kind of dichotomous
separate animal rights versus, whatever. And of course the demographic question, and thank you for that, because I think it's now making me think in that direction, is also because, of course, you have to see the costs of this. The coming of the sanctuary, and why this becomes a big question is because the people are moved, right? So you've got all these villages which people are simply moved away. Remember that India doesn't have a rehabilitation policy. There is no formal, official rehabilitation policy. So it's all done very ad hocly, and people will tell me that, when they did the Ranthambore sanctuary, people will move from Ranthambore to Jaisalmer. Now, if you think about the topography of Jaisalmer, which is so vastly different from what's here, right? I mean, these are lush green forests, right? And so, I wanted to show pictures, but I always think I'll probably spend 10 minutes talking about the problems of representation if I show photographs. So I simply just kind of sit there. I'm not showing photographs. But it's a slightly, can you see that? So it's the posing of the question itself in dichotomous terms is something that is not part of that discourse. It's a very different thing. And of course the whole question of eating and all that question is doesn't quite apply, because the eating habits of cuisines are vastly different. So it's a very, but yes, but I think it's important to think about how they might be different from the animal rights. And they are, because of the question of dichotomy. Yeah. As you can see, the demographic question has pushed me to think, and I have to say I hadn't thought about that, so this is very valuable. Thank you. We'll have to continue this conversation because I think it's far too complex. I mean, I don't want to be glib and say things, but I hope that example showed that it does work. Yeah.
I think it's in some ways related to what she was saying. I think something that we seem to be missing in the whole discussion on modernity is the question of religion.
Yes.
Okay, and even in the presentation that was plenary that was made yesterday, I think we need to bring back what could be the theology of haq itself, if it is not vis-a-vis the state that we are talking about. Okay, I think it's located very differently, and if we are able to bring in the discourse of religion into these kind of discourses, I think we would benefit far more than what we are able to do now, I suppose. I think again, it's about origin of concepts itself. I mean, which has been picked up from there to bring into the discourse of how do you fight for human rights vis-a-vis the state.
One last question.
I really want to know, when you say rights require implementation by the state, even though they are non-derivative, and the third point, haq is dynamic and has justification independent from the state. I just want to know your take on what happens if there are conflict of rights. One, and two, I was thinking with the whole idea of the question of prior. The question of prior, if there is a kind of a conflict of priority, so how this would be tackled in this kind of a hierarchization?
If possible, short answer.
Very short. Religion, yes. Religion, yes. Right. Yes. Thought I'd do the right thing always. Never mind. Yes, religionism. The thing is, the really interesting thing is to see the take-up of particular kinds of religious premises in particular political struggles, right? So that's the question. And one sees that coming out very clearly, particularly in the struggles of the Anjuman Mazareen in Pakistan, where you would find, I have narratives about talking about how the right to land, this is again for military, so who has occupied their farmlands, and so the land, the right to their land, or the right of the Mazareen to their land depends on, is based on the fact that paragraph 3 of the Quran talks about that people have rights to land. But this is not in the kind of ways in which, say, somebody like Clifford Geertz and people will talk about in that Islamic jurisprudentialist sense. This is very much using particular concepts, a religious concept and a religious idea for non-religious or even secular ends. So it's a very different kind of way in which...
I'm not just talking about the secular ends. I'm I'm
Yeah.
talking about the very theology of haq itself
Yeah.
needs to be located differently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Your point about
Rights require implementation by the state.
that's right. Yeah.
At the same time, if there's a kind of conflict of
Yeah.
rights in this discourse,
Yeah.
what would be the take of state and the whole idea of prior?
Yeah.
Rights prior to
Yeah.
the state. So
Yeah.
if there's a kind of a conflict, is there prior domain? Who is prior?
Oh yeah. Okay. So right. So yes. Yes. So the thing is that the entitlements of the prior. So this is particularly within Adivasi communities, right? The one that I'm looking at. So I don't want to make a very generalized claim, over generalized, excessive claim. But this is particularly. So what you have is that you have haq that applies to particular kinds of contexts and particular kinds of conflicts. So for example, and for that they have tribal, the sitting, the community leaders and things, Manjgaria in the case of the Beals in Kotara, who will sit and decide on, what are customary rights involved in all of this. But of course the really interesting thing is that when it comes to other kinds of rights, so for example in the case of, removal of, say, if the word went around that, they're going to move people away because those villages have to be moved because of the sanctuary and things like that. Of course they're not. They are also using the non-derivative language of the state, but at the same time also appealing to the state, right? So it happens simultaneously, you see what I mean? It's not something, but in particular, if I may just call personal context or interpersonal context, you have the kind of, the conflict between various kinds of haq are resolved at a very non-state or non-institutional or formal institutional level, right? But which is not to say that haq doesn't apply, that the constitutional legal rights do not apply to those domains. It does, and that's why I was talking about the question of gender, right? So it is the case that, remember, all those community leaders are men, right? And they're talking about particular kinds of provisioning within community relations, and that's what haq does, right? It talks about what is due, right? What is seen as the legitimate due to somebody, right? And that's how the actual meaning of haq in some ways is what is due, right? So when the domains of conflict are interpersonal, or they are to do with community relations, they will be resolved within the context of, say, Bangarias and things like that. But when it comes to questions of gender, gender justice, and when that discourse is not available, right? What do you do when that discourse is simply not available in that particular? That's what I'm saying. The limits, the ontological limits of haq, comes to the fore when the question of gender and intersectional identity comes to the fore. Right? So at that moment you start going to other kinds of places for conflict resolution. Yes? But only so does that make fair? But these are things which happen in different domains differently, but can also be simultaneous. So you might do
okay.
one to the Bangladesh and you also
Thank you so much. I guess haq will be the conference dinner subject.